Morning, everybody. How are we doing? You hear me okay? Hello. Good morning. Seems like it's been a long time. It hasn't been. It's just been a week, but I guess because we had the break in the middle there. Let's see. Hey, Mac, you're logged on twice. Look at that. Interesting. That's no problem. Whatever you need to do.
Yeah,
You got
one
a
of
nice
them is my
break.
fault.
Let's see. Let me get things set up. Okay. Let's see. If you guys have any questions about the exam, I'd be happy to answer them. General questions, I guess. But if you'd like to make a meeting with me or something like that and go over your exam in detail, I'd also be happy to do that. Some of you have reached out about that. But I'd be happy to meet with any of you. There are two more grades that go into the final grade, and that is the final exam and then the take-home paper. The final exam will be very much like your midterm, except it will cover everything that we've learned since the midterm. There will be a little bit of content from the first half of the course on the final exam. It's not cumulative, but clearly there's some themes that are going to come up again. So you don't need to study detail of the first half of the course material, but it'd be a good idea for you to review the exam and review your notes at least. So if I may ask you to make connections to do some integration between the first half and the second half, you're able to do that. But it's not cumulative in the sense that you're not going to be tested on any details from the first half of the course. And then the take home is just a very straightforward one question essay. I think I usually ask people to do between 3 and 5 pages of an answer. So imagine it as kind of an expanded like integration question, like the type of questions you got in the part 4 of your midterm. It would be another question like that. And it would be open book. And most people do really well on this. I rarely get anyone who gets below an 85 or 90 even. So think of it as a way for you to boost your grade. It's open book and you'll have the full week to do it. So there really shouldn't be much of a problem. Okay, any questions on the midterm or the final or the take home right now? Oh, okay. I assume everyone's hearing me okay? Just shake your little heads.
Actually, I do have a
Okay,
question.
good. Thank you. All right.
Hang on a second. When exactly is the final exam test? Do you know what the day is?
Feels early in the morning for me. But I'm at the beach. How can things be better? Hey, you know what I heard today? This is good. This is going to put you in a good mood. They are now estimating that we can all get the vaccine by June, which is actually, I think, a lot faster than a lot of us expected it. I thought we were going to have another at-home summer, but if things go well, they're pushing things through, and so far everything seems like it's working well. We could have a real summer. So in honor of that, here we are at the beach in Hawaii, maybe? I don't know. Okay, hopefully that puts you in a good mood, and so we can continue with our discussion of Gibson. All right. And let's just remember where we were on this. Oh, I know a couple of you weren't able to make the last class before break. Assuming that video works okay, and if it doesn't, please let me know as soon as possible, and we can try to fix it. But I posted it, so I know some of you are going to depend on that video to do your studying. So it seems to work okay. All right, cool. Let me know if there's any problems with it. Okay, so let's continue talking about the direct approach. And we'll do so by doing a quick review as we had done it last week. So, we talked about the ecological approach from the perspective of why embellishment was needed. And we reintroduced all that through the barriers to realism. We reminded you what they were, some examples of each, and then we talked about kind of a meta-theoretical, kind of a kind of almost philosophical sort of notion that underlies the barriers to realism, at least according to Gibson. And that is the idea that in most of psychology, we kind of assume that the animal and environment can be defined independent of each other. And therefore, it allows for a different description of the environment than what we give the animal. And Gibson said, well, when you're talking about behavior, you really do need to consider the ecology or the specific niche context of the animal. And in that sense, the animal and environment are interdefined and are best served then by a common set of descriptors over both things, over the environment and the animal. And that's really more than anything what makes the ecological approach truly ecological. As I said, when people think of the ecological approach and they don't have much of a background to it, they think about it as really being the push for representative design, that we try to understand how the human behaves in its natural context, and we try to bring those important features of the context to the laboratory. The tasks are more kind of behaviorally relevant, and the stimuli are more behaviorally relevant. But what I'm trying to say here is Gibson meant a lot more than that about the ecology part of ecological. He's saying that we need to really reconceive of the informational input as animal dependent. And we need to conceive of the animal's behavior and perception and I guess perceptual mechanism as dependent on the niche. And in so doing, what he's going to argue is it allows for a reconceptualization of what the information available to the animal might be. Okay, so it's not just putting the animal in its natural context, it's trying to see if, in doing that in a thorough manner, if in fact the informational input can be thought of as something different, which could then allow for reconsideration of the purpose of cognition and the brain. So it's far-reaching in that sense, right? Because consider, if in fact you can show that the informational input about the environment is something that is fully informative about the sort of behaviors an animal performs, then the idea of an embellishment, the idea of enhancement of a degraded input can be rethought, can be put into question. And that's exactly what we're talking about here. And what I'm doing for this first example is kind of giving you an introduction the way I do it with undergraduate perception students. So this is supposed to be too intuitive. We're then going to kind of get much more technical on it, but I want to give you a gut feeling of it. And that's why I introduced this kind of very fundamental question about how we perceive a three-dimensional spatial world based on a two-dimensional image. And we discussed from other perspectives that we've been entertaining this quarter that it gets enhanced through some sort of intermediary processes, through inferences, through organizational principles, through fancy pants connection patterns, all those sort of things that we've been discussing through the quarter. So that's why embellishment is needed, that there's a disconnect between our perceptual experience and the degraded stimulus. And that would be an example, of course, of the independence of sensation from perception. But that's based on the fact that there's nothing specific about the stimulus regarding the world. So that's another barrier, which is the intractable non-specificity. Okay, so what Gibson wants to remind us here is that a lot of how we've been conceiving of the input is kind of, I guess you'd say, scientifically idealized, methodologically idealized. So, just to give an intuitive example here, and we're going to, again, get much more complex. Let's think of Molyneux's problem, one of his problems, where we have two stimuli out in the world that in fact project the same retinal image. So the proximal stimuli, A, the big arrow, C, the small arrow, both project the same retinal image, which is right here. We can label that AC. And that is then posed as a problem for perception, since there's an ambiguity relative to what's in the world, ambiguity in the proximal stimulus relative to what's in the world, the distal stimulus. Somehow the brain, the mental process, has to enhance that to come up with a solution, allowing us to perceive and then interact with a world. And so what Gibson's saying is here in this specific example is kind of very, very obvious that the stimulus is conceived as something in empty space. The distal stimulus is conceived as something in empty space. And that is, in fact, going to create these ambiguous proximal images. And just to make it intuitive, he's going to say, let's rethink about what really the stimulus is. These are, kind of idealized, both methodologically, conceptually idealized distal stimuli that the animal never encounters. And the perceptual systems didn't evolve to detect. In other words, he's saying by kind of assuming this kind of animal independent sort of description of the stimulus, okay, we are posing a problem for the brain that is really invalid. It's not a problem for the brain if we consider what the stimulus context truly is. And again, this is going to seem very simple-minded in a way. I'm just making it intuitive. He's going to say, let's really think about how the input is presented to the animal. So we always, as terrestrial beings, we always interact with things that are on the ground plane of one type or another. This is how our perceptual systems have evolved, to detect objects, to detect relevant world objects that are perceived and behave towards relative to a ground plane. So we're going to go from this type of conception to this type of conception, where everything we see is seen relative to other things and seen relative to a ground plane. Okay. And that ground plane is going to have texture, and whether the ground plane can be discussed in terms of things outside like grass and rocks and dirt paths and all that sort of stuff that we probably evolved to interact with, as well as things that are in our more modern kind of self-fashioned spaces like the insides of our houses and kitchens and tables and all that sort of stuff that we are spending so much time with now. All these things involve planes with texture. And in fact, that is part of the input. Okay? That is an essential part of the input. There are very few examples where we are not faced with that. Yeah, flying in an airplane through clouds, but it's it's not something that we've evolved. That's not part of kind of the perceptual context that kind of shaped our perceptual organs and our nervous system. And that even if you're a bird, birds are flying relative to the ground and seeing ground planes. And yes, they do fly through clouds and are faced with that sometimes, but that is not the normal situation. Okay, so there is always a ground plane that we perceive relative to, and that ground plane has texture. And then when you conceive of that as the input and not cues, okay, and this is going to be the important move that goes kind of beyond what the intuitions are. He's going to say that is part of the input, that it is not like we analyze things out in empty space and then look for cues. He's saying that this, always seeing things relative to the ground plane, is what the perceptual system, in this case the visual system, is sensitive to. It's always sensitive to relations. Then the input can be conceived as potentially things that are not ambiguous. So these things on the ground are going to provide input to the visual system that's unambiguous. Okay, and this is where the move is. This is the big move. Okay? I'm giving it to you in a very kind of simplified way just to make it intuitive, but the big move is to see if we can consider the input as unambiguous, to look for lawful forms of proximal stimulation is completely going to reject this intractable non-specificity sort of assumption, okay, and say, let's think about how the input can actually be specific. Because boy, if you can do that, you're really changing, kind of the job description of the nervous system. The nervous system becomes less of a computational or connectionist device that needs to enhance input, and rather becomes something more like a detection device that needs to pick up on what this rich input is like. Okay. And again, just to kind of make it intuitive, this is something that Gibson talks about. You can read all about this. I just want to, again, we're kind of sticking with the intuitive examples here for now. That he makes a big deal out of the kind of lawful properties, the reliable properties of what he calls texture gradients. And the idea of a texture gradient is, imagine you're always interacting with some sort of texture plane, whether it is a table, whether it's the floor of your kitchen, whether it's the rocks on a beach or the grass on African plains or something like that. There is always some sort of gradient of texture, so that you think of it as the plane recedes. Okay, as this gradient recedes, it becomes more dense further out and more coarse closer in. Okay, that's what's meant by a gradient here. All right. And this is something that's reliable. I mean, certainly it's these things are randomly strewn, but statistically speaking, at least, out here is much more coarse than in here. All right. So what does this mean? Well, potentially this can support ambiguous information for things like relative distance. Okay, so the relative distance of these different cylinders is being conveyed. Yes, you can think of it as cues, but Gibson's saying, let's consider this as more than cues because this is the input all the time, right? And things like relative size might be a cue, but when it comes to texture gradients, this is the type of reliable input that the visual system detected as it evolved into a useful sort of mechanism. And so what he's saying, this is unambiguous information for distance, and also can be unambiguous information for size. And again, don't think of this in terms of cues. Think about this in terms of information that is always available, except for flying through clouds. It is always available. And it's not something that involves adding additional properties to first analyzed things floating in empty space like these spheres or these cylinders here. The input is always seeing objects relative to other sorts of objects, including the most important object, which is the gradient of the ground. And so this becomes an essential part of the input. These seeing things relative to texture gradients is what the perceptual systems are built to detect. Not things individually and plus the cues, but things relative to other things. Okay, and that's absolutely critical. What else? Well, in the real world, okay, we move. Not only do we always interact with the ground, but we move. And yes, the moving could involve actually walking and exploring, which Gibson clearly wants to make a really important part of the story. But even when we're still, our heads move, and even when our heads are still, okay, our eyes move, and even when we think our eyes are still, when we look straight ahead, you probably know this from other classes, we've got these little microsaccades. Okay, so our eyes are always jiggling. They don't work if they don't, right? You probably have learned this somewhere down the line, but there's kind of icky ways that you can kind of offset the microsaccades that refresh the retina, where you place a little, I think what they used to do is take a contact lens and put like a little tiny baby projector on the end of it and project images into the retina. But because of that projector connected to a contact lens that's moving around with the eye, okay, that in a sense offsets these little microsaccades that refresh the retina. And when you do that, when you offset those microsaccades, the image that is being projected in your eye disappears. I assume that you guys have learned that's kind of a classic thing. Don't worry about the details of that, but they kind of disappear in interesting ways. But the fact that we're using these microsaccades like this means two things. First, it does refresh the retina, but secondly, we need to consider this as really important information, that the idea that the eyes are taking snapshots, like still snapshots, and kind of blending them together for movement is really kind of the opposite from how the input should be conceived. The input for Gibson should be conceived as flow, as always flowing across the eye. So it's not like the eye takes a snapshot, then compares properties of this snapshot to other snapshots it's taking or something like that. Instead, the stimulus and the eye is always going to involve a flow across the retina. Always. It's always a time-dependent sort of stimulus. And this is how I teach it to undergrads, so I can introduce this idea of distance perception. So the proximal image is always flowing for Gibson. It's a very, very important concept. It's always flowing. There's always a time dimension involved in what the stimulus is. And just as one intuitive example, if you can imagine yourself driving from Riverside to LA, maybe some of you drove home over the Thanksgiving break or drove to a friend's house or something like that. And we're very safe, I'm sure. When you're driving down the freeway and you look out the side window, it's just kind of an intuitive example of how important flow is to us. What that's showing there in that image is this guy on a train looking out at a fixation point, and things that are close to him as he's looking flow by at a rate that's faster than things that are far away. Right, and you've all experienced this, right? If you look out to the gravel on the side of the road on the shoulder, or the fences, the gates, the protective gates that are along the side of the road, they zoom by. Where if you look out towards the mountains, they seem to kind of move more slowly and almost follow you. My kids used to love how the moon would follow them around town. It would look at everything else is moving around, everything else is flying by us, but the moon follows. And it's kind of something that I think people all have some sort of introspective experience with. But it's known to be an absolutely reliable, lawful type of information, that the object distance depends on how fast it flows across the retina. And this is maybe something you've learned before, a term you've learned before, motion parallax. And what it basically is unambiguous information for relative distance. So, if you wanted to, you could just put your fingers out like this, have a finger closer, a finger farther, and if you move your head and look to the side, you can see that the finger that's closer is kind of flowing across your visual field faster than the finger that's further. Okay? Just like that. And if you read the textbooks, it's called motion parallax, but it really is a much more profound example, in the sense that this is unambiguous information for relative distance. And yeah, these things can move a little bit, there's no question. But again, we're talking about, if you take motion parallax in the context of texture gradients, there's always going to be that information available to tell you something about relative distance as you move, right? And there's research showing very, very little movement of the eye is needed for motion parallax to become useful type of information. It's not this, I'm giving you the example of driving down the freeway because it's intuitive, but all you need is a little saccade in order to experience that difference, or in order to have the information, whether it's consciously experienced or not. It's going to be reliable information for relative distance. So these are just two intuitive ways that Gibson's going to make this problem of distance perception and how we get a third dimension from the input by putting the animal in its ecological context. One more way, not only are we moving all the time, but many of the, now let's forget that, many of the objects that we encounter move as well, and that can provide important information to us. And we'll be talking about this in just a second in some detail. There's some great examples of this, and we do some of this stuff in my lab, so I have a certain fondness for it. But these examples that you may have been taught about in other classes that we call structure from motion, and where hopefully you can see this okay through Zoom. This is showing just dots that when moving in a coordinated fashion can actually tell you something about the structure of the objects that are being depicted. Hopefully you're seeing cubes kind of doing little circle dances there, and here they're going to get synchronized like they're dancing together. And these examples are called structure for motion, where there really isn't any other information available about the structure of that cube besides the motion information that's available. And what Gibson wants to say is some of the most important things that we perceive, including each other, okay, involve motion of themselves, right? So one of the things that we perceive best are faces and bodies of other people, and all, we've discussed all the imitation and stuff that goes on. And certainly the brain's designed to detect the intent and the I guess the will of other people to some degree to make us social and effective social animals. Well, that's going to involve perception based on somebody else's motion, and the brain seems especially sensitive to that, to the point where it can perceive somebody's structure, including the facial structure, and intent based on motion alone. And here's another great example. And there's a whole field of what's called point light studies, where points of light are put on people's joints of the body, and that can tell you a lot about, first of all, you're looking at a person. Second of all, in this case, you're looking at two people, what the people are doing. As you'll see, you can determine things about gender, action, how much weight a person is lifting, all that sort of stuff. And we're able to get all of that from motion. There's nothing else in here telling us about structure. The structure that there's two people, one larger than the other, one walking forward, one standing still, besides the relative motion. And it's just a really nice example that I'll be talking about in detail in just a second. So one way to think about the problem of going from a proximal stimulus that's in 2 dimensions to a perceptual experience that's in 3 dimensions is just to really, again, to make it intuitive, just think about one move that Gibson is making here is he's adding essentially another dimension to the proximal stimulus. You're saying, yeah, you can understand the proximal stimulus as being 2-dimensional. There's, they are 2-dimensional screens, those retina in the back of the eye, but realize that they are always flowing. That stimulus is always flowing. And so it's 2 dimensions of space plus a dimension of time that is giving us information, reliable, lawful information about structure. And structure in this case is the structure of cubes, the structure of people. In other words, we are perceiving solidity. We are perceiving a 3rd dimension, partly from how things move and also how we move. And so in that sense, the proximal stimulus really can't be considered just 2-dimensional. Spatially, I guess it is, but we need to consider time. And time is going to give us that 3rd dimension. And actually, it's going to give us time dimensions too. But just to make this intuitive, we can leave it at that. So again, as I said, these are kind of just intuitive examples. We're going to get much more technical in just a second. But this is the way that Gibson wants to proceed. He wants to find evidence that there is rich, specificational information observable in natural contexts. He's going to completely. The first move is to reconceive of an animal environment mutuality, not a dualism. Okay, we can define these things by each other, the animal and its niche.
The perception of three-dimensional
Oh.
forms can also occur when observing the motions of far more complex objects.
Okay, sorry about that. I hope you weren't hearing that the whole time, and I have no idea why it just popped up like that, but okay. I borrowed this from another video tutorial. What was I saying? That so not only is he going to use the animal environment mutuality as a really critical move, but immediately following from that, he's going to suggest that in accepting an animal environment mutuality, can we show ways in which the input is in fact rich and specificational, meaning that it's completely connected to the things in the world, so that the perceptual process's job becomes a lot lighter. It's not a question of recreating the world, of enhancement, of embellishment, because the input, he's going to start with the assumption that the input can be shown to be sufficient. It's not a question of recreating the world based on degraded information. It's a question of detecting rich information to perceive a world veridically. And what I mean by veridically here is going to be relative to what an animal behaves and perceives the world to be, which we'll talk about more in just a second. Okay, so let's start talking about some more technical examples of what might be considered specificational, sort of reliable information. And the first type I want to talk about is called global flow. And hopefully you're able to see a video of a roller coaster. But what I'm most interested in is whether you have an experience of vection, meaning self-motion here. I do, even though I'm just looking at a really crappy old video. I'm sure that if you guys, folks play video games or, you go to the motion simulator rides at amusement parks, you know exactly what these things are. And they're very effective, right? I mean, we'll talk about the Star Tours and Simpsons Ride and all those in just a second. But this works for me right now. I felt my stomach go up a little bit. When my kids were young, we had a roller coaster designer app on the iPhone. And iPhones were pretty small back then. And so it allowed you to kind of put pieces of a roller coaster together and then ride that roller coaster from the perspective of sitting in one of the cars. And, my wife would watch us do this, and I'd have my two sons next to me, my two little sons next to me, and we'd be sitting there watching this newly built roller coaster. And she said that she would see us kind of swaying, like, in unison back and forth as we were watching, and my kids would go, wee, and all that great stuff. And, think about what that image looks like. It's just a tiny little image, and there's so much more kind of more stationary, visual world around us in the visual field. But boy, you need very little for this to induce kind of an experience of self-motion. And this is perfectly sensible given, what Gibson said, that this is a reliable type of information that your brain has been designed to detect and to more or less interpret as self-motion. That when all the texture that we're experiencing in a visual field is flowing across our retinas, it only means one thing. It means that we ourselves are moving. And that's kind of the point of this. Whenever we move in the real world, we induce what Gibson called a global flow. And what a global flow means is that all the texture in the visual field is kind of flowing across your retina. Okay, I think you have an intuition of what that means. I guess all the texture except for the one kind of infinitely small point towards which you're moving. But, we're talking about certainly all the other texture is flowing. Okay. And that's something that always happens. That is a kind of a lawfully connected sort of state of affairs, that when we move, global flow occurs in the natural world. Okay? Imagine yourself riding a bike, driving a car, even walking, even just sitting there and kind of moving your eyes back and forth. It induces a global flow, different forms of global flow, but global flow nonetheless. So it makes sense for us to have a perceptual mechanism that detects global flow and gives us information that we're moving. Okay? And this would then be the basis for motion simulator rides and things like that. Okay, so this is a lawful type of information that the perceptual systems, the nervous system, has evolved to detect. And when it detects that global flow in the natural world, it only means one thing. It means that, in fact, the observer is moving. Okay, there are very few instances I can think of in the natural world where there's a global flow without a person's motion. One of the only things I can think of in the kind of natural, non-artifactual world is sometimes when you're on the beach, maybe when this happened to me when I've been boogie boarding with my kids. I'll be coming out of the beach and kind of shaking my head so the water gets out of my face, and I'll look down and there'll be all of a sudden I'll see the bubbles of the tide all of a sudden recede very quickly. And so if I'm looking down, if that's all I see, it kind of knocks me over a little bit. It kind of makes me a little dizzy. I have to kind of catch myself. I'm sure it's knocked over my little kid. My kids were little when we used to go. It is a global, one of the few kind of natural global flow situations. There are others that are not as natural, and those are interesting too. In fact, long before there were these fancy motion simulator rides, researchers realized that the global flow would be informative about a person's self-motion, and therefore felt they probably could induce an experience of self-motion using synthetic global flow. Sorry, everybody. Sorry. I set all these. I set all these to silent before the class today. I have no idea why the sound pops in again. So what does that involve? Well, in the old days, before there were these, beautifully rendered motion simulator rides with computers and video and all that stuff, what they used to do to test this out, this is in the 70s, is they would build basically rooms that were either on wheels or were suspended from high ceilings. And I've actually built one of these years ago in the basement of the old psychology building. We did it for purposes of sound flow rather than visual flow, but we also tested visual flow in one of our control conditions. And what we built, and this is very similar to what the ones from the 70s, is we built a room that was about the size of a walk-in closet with drywall. And like 2x4s and all that sort of stuff. And then we put it on a whole bunch of bicycle wheels. And the idea was that subjects would go in and stand in the middle. And I should say that the drywall had a lot of textured wallpaper. So I think we used that kind of checkerboard stuff that's very textured, black and white checkerboards. And people would go in and they'd stand there. And then what we would do is we'd tell them to stand as still as possible. We would slowly move the room back and forth, like, this around them, which involved the front wall coming up and back and that. And we actually had a back wall and a ceiling as well. And we'd ask people to tell us what they were experiencing. And everybody told us, yeah, this is in fact an experience where I feel I'm so sorry. I have no idea. Anyway, they would tell us that they felt themselves moving. And that's how this was tested originally in the 70s. And people would have a very strong experience of motion. In fact, what that little set of pictures down in the lower right shows is a work on infants that a good colleague of mine helped with. Eleanor Gibson actually did some of this research. and that's James Gibson's wife. They would put toddlers in moving rooms, and they would put mattresses and cushions on the floor so no toddlers were injured during the making of this experiment. But they would, put them in the center and start moving the room back and forth, and the toddlers would flop over immediately onto the mattresses, and they loved it. I mean, it sounds dastardly, but the toddlers would get up and scream more, and then I got to see some of these experiments being run. They loved it, and they were actually filming the toddlers, so they got a sense of how much motion was needed to topple them over, at what point in the motion they toppled over, all these sort of things. With adults, what typically is done in these sort of experiments is they ask people to stand on force plates, which are now very cheap. In the old days, they were really expensive. But basically, they're like those, I don't know if you guys know what the Wii system is. I can't remember who made the Wii system, Xbox or something like that. I don't know. But basically, there's these platforms that allow video games to kind of monitor where your center of gravity is and things like that. And that's exactly what these experiments do. These platforms allow the experimenter to monitor a subject's center of gravity as they stand there. And what they find is that subjects not only experience their emotion, but they actually shift subtly and kind of imperceptibly to the person who's experienced this. They actually shift their center of gravity in coordination with the movement of the room. Their job is to stand as still as possible, not to move at all, but they can't help it. Their center of gravity does move back and forth with the motion of the room. And by the way, I should say it works backwards and forwards. I'm so sorry. It works backwards and forwards. So it's not just that when they move, so the room moves this way, they start moving back as if to coordinate themselves with the room. It's not like they're afraid that the wall's coming and going to hit them. Instead, it is just a coordination of what they experience as their own motion, and it's the way for the body to kind of compensate for that experience of motion, even though they themselves are never moving. You're not surprised by this because you've probably experienced the Star Tours ride and the Simpsons ride, which I don't know it's still there, but I know that there's a Minion ride. I know there's a Spider-Man ride at Universal Studios. I don't know if the Simpsons ride is still there. I used to love the Simpsons ride. I thought it was hysterically funny, and I think it's a very good motion simulation. It works. I think it works really well. And by the way, I from the book I wrote, I actually interviewed some of the folks that design motion simulator rides, and it goes beyond our discussion in this class. But I'd be happy to tell you about their little tricks if you're ever interested in that, or I could send you a piece of the book or something like that. But I think probably there are now more motion simulator rides at Universal Studios than there are actual motion rides. That's how effective these things are. People do feel themselves moving. The drops in the Star Tours ride and the Simpsons ride when I was young, when I first moved to California, young professor, there was a Back to the Future ride where you kind of go down a dinosaur's mouth or something like that. And, people would scream, it was really effective, even though, as you probably know, the cars only move at the most 5 feet in any direction. They move like that, so you can feel like you're dropping, but there's no motion like this, right? That's all induced by the visual flow. And the idea here is that this flow works because, according to Gibson, this is a type of visual information that is reliable, that has helped shape the brain to detect it and then to know a state of affairs. It is a specificational type of information, okay? Let me show you what I mean by that. Let me get a little bit more formal about that. If we're talking, global flow can, by the way, can be induced in many different situations. And it doesn't just have to be forward motion. It can be, when we move backward, as the moving room moves backward, that sort of thing, or when we move to the side. These are all instances of global flow. But what global flow will tell us is that we are, in fact, moving, okay? So that we can think of it like this. So I'm going to talk about it in terms of forward movement, but it doesn't have to be forward. When we move forward, okay, there is a lawful generation. What I mean by that it's always going to be the case when we move forward, there is a production of this sort of visual stimulation across the retina. Again, what global flow means here is all the texture that's flowing across the retina is moving. It's all flowing, okay? It's global, meaning all the texture is flowing. Okay? In this case, since we're moving forward, it's in a specific way, okay? It moves outward like this, okay? But that's just one example. And because of that fact, because there's that lawful relationship between global flow and movement, okay, it provides reliable information. Okay? It is specifying it so that whenever the nervous system detects global flow, it knows it's moving. And in this case, it's moving forward. Okay? And, I'm just making a big deal of this because I wanted to give a nice, I think, pretty compelling example of what Gibson means here by specificational information. That it is an information form, this global flow, that tells of a state of affairs between an animal and environment, the forward movement in this case, or movement whatsoever. Okay? It is not something that needs to be interpreted. It's not like a cue. It is something that is telling the animal that something is happening out in the natural environment, and it's only this thing. It is an example he would want to propose that allows for the beginning of a rejection of the doctrine of intractable non-specificity. Here we have a type of information available to the eyes that is in fact specificational about something that's happening in the world. A perceiver is moving, in this case forward. Okay. Let me take a little break here and see if there's any questions before we continue with this.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
There you are.
Cool. Thank you. Because I'm using my new headphones, and I feel a little bit.
Sounds really good, Mac.
Thank you. The thing that I wanted to ask is just like about the logic here. So the purpose of all these kind of things is to like reject the doctrine of intractable specificity, right?
Non-specificity, yeah.
Yeah. So the thing is that, I mean, yeah, we can know whether the thing is how the thing is like by combining the two-dimensional information and the temporal information or textual information together. But that doesn't mean two-dimensional information plus temporal information equals to three-dimensional information.
Well, it doesn't mean, if you're asking, does that mean like the brain has to add this information together or something like that? No. Actually, one way to think about all this, when you go through the Gibson book, whatever it's called, the 79 book that I've posted pieces of, you'll see that he is really trying to take the brain nervous system process out of the equation as much as possible. Now, I tend to refer to the nervous system as I talk about this, just because I think it makes it intuitive in the context of other things we've discussed in the class. But what he wants to do is actually almost remove the perceiver and talk about just kind of what's available to just a point of observation that's just moving. And he's saying that it's the job of the scientist to reconceive of what this information is. So the scientist is saying, oh, it's not just a two-dimensional stimulus on the eye. It's actually better described as a two-dimensional stimulus that flows. So it's the scientist's job to say, oh, there's a time dimension there, and that's available. So it's not the job, I'm not giving a kind of an equation for the brain to kind of put together. I'm giving an equation for the scientist to kind of re-describe the input so the brain is able to detect that, just detect that information. So he almost wants to take the perceiver out to a large degree. Does that help?
Yeah. So you know, so maybe he is just like, maybe I got it wrong. So I mean, maybe it's like he's just building the relationship like directly between the distal stimuli and then proximal stimuli, right? Like like he's just saying that they're just pretty the same because we are like, we just forgot about the temporal information or texture information.
Well, that's just one example, right? That temporal thing. I hope that's very clear. So don't push that too far. You're going to see other examples. Well, I mean, it's in every part of the stimulus. It needs to be considered. But there's other ways in which the input can be reconceived as completely specificational to what's in the world without that time dimension. So let's not overvalue that little equation that I used before. That was really just to make it intuitive, okay? So he's after specificational information, and in doing that, it again, the idea ultimately is to take the pressure off of the brain in a way. So it's like, let's not think of the brain having to do all this really fancy stuff to recreate a world because the input is insufficient. Let's see if we can rethink of the input as sufficient, so the brain ultimately will do more of a detection sort of operation than a rebuilding operation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think I understand his logic.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and also I have another real quick question.
Sure.
So, yeah, what about the incommensurability of natural kinds? Like, where does the meaning come from?
We are absolutely going to get into that.
Okay.
So meaning, right? You're after meaning here, aren't you?
Yeah.
Yeah, me too. Aren't we all? Yeah, no, I'm glad you asked that, and we will hopefully get to, I think we'll get to that probably within the next hour. It's a great question. Okay, anything else at this point, though? Anything from anybody else? All right. By the way, is my connection okay today? Everything working okay? I put in, over the break, I put in a new mesh system. And so, I've had some issues with the connection here in my garage. Boy, this mesh system seems to be working great. I don't know if you guys are familiar with this, but it's got basically 3 different Wi-Fi transmitters. So there's one now right here, and it seems to be working great. So if you have trouble at home with your internet, if you have weak spots of internet, it's $150. It's pretty great. Okay. Let's continue then. All right, that's too much Larry. All right, there we go. Yeah, so specificational information is the really important idea here. Just like Mac asked here, it is really the thing that's going to be driving this. Gibson wants to basically find a way of thinking of input information as fully informative, as something that is going to tell the perceiver what's in the world, so the perceiver doesn't have to create it. So we'll talk more about this in a second, but we're really not talking about cues that embellish the input. We're thinking of ways that the information itself, thinking about it as relational, thinking about it as always in context, whether it's the context of texture gradients, the context of time, whatever, is sufficient. Okay, that's where we're going with this. Okay, now this is, I think, a really great example to give you some sense of what specificational information is. Remember way back in the beginning of the quarter, we talked about the simulative assumption. I think we talked about that, didn't we? The simulative and the projective assumption. And the idea in the simulative assumption was that, we could kind of take a cross-section of the light, and it was kind of an old idea by I think the Greeks. You take a cross-section of light and you would see kind of a mini two-dimensional version in the light of the thing that you're looking at. So there's a simulation of objects in the light that ultimately gets completely degraded and is degraded in and of itself because it's smaller, right? And it's two-dimensional and all that sort of stuff. But the idea that we thought of information kind of like a mini version, a mini distorted, kind of meaningless type of version of the thing we were looking at, was something that kind of ran through most of the theories we've discussed. So think about the eye looking at a tree. You take a cross section of the light there, and there's like, it's like, you would assume that there's a mini tree in the light, right? There's a mini tree in the light. So the input looked like a very degraded version of the perceptual object, the distal object out in the world. Okay, that's what's meant by simulative information. And what Gibson's going to say is that's not the way to think about specificational information. Let's not think about that. Let's think about specificational information as not looking like the thing in the world, but being informative about the thing in the world. So you shouldn't, think about the information for a tree being the image of a tree. The information for a tree is going to be some complex kind of flow across the eye, as it's gathering texture of the tree relative to the background and all that sort of thing. So he's going to reject the idea that the stimulation, in fact, is a simulation of the things in the world, and the input's much more abstract. Before I go into this example, let me step back a second and talk about this time dimension on the retina again. So Gibson's clearly going to reject the idea that the eye is taking photographs of the world, which is fine. I think most of us would reject that these days. Wasn't always the case, by the way, but I think it's fine. We know motion's a very important part. Time is a very important dimension in the stimulus. So, okay, what's the better metaphor? If the eye's not taking pictures of the world, is it taking videos of the world? And he would say no. Back then they had film. You say, no, that's not the right idea either. So what is the right metaphor for what the eye is doing? And I think what he might say is you can kind of conceive of the eye as kind of detecting textures, kind of gathering textures in a way, not unlike your hand does. Okay, what do I mean by that? Well, think about this, and there are old experiments that involve these sort of things. But how do we use our hands when we're at night? When it's dark and we can't see things, and you're looking for your iPhone or your glasses or something like that. You kind of feel around, and as you feel around that you are actually, to do this well, you're actually creating a flow of texture across your hand. Okay, in the old experiments I was referring to, they would involve people putting out their hands and then allowing the hand to have snapshots of an object, and then people would try to recognize that object visually, or they're given the object and it's put in their hand and they're allowed to create a flow of texture across their hand as they're feeling something. Without question, people are better at the situation where they are actually able to induce a flow of texture across their hands. Okay, so that's how Gibson wants us to think of the eye, as kind of like hands that are collecting the textures of, or the flow of texture of light across the retina. Like, imagine, like, we have hands in the back of our eyes, and here comes texture. And that type of texture, I'm feeling things like my flat computer, and I've got a rough table that it's on right now, right? All those things are created based on kind of how texture flows across the skin of my hands. Gibson wants to think of the eyes as flows of textured light. We'll talk about the details of that in a second. Texture in light flowing across our retina. So that's quite a different metaphor for the eye. It's moving from a camera to kind of almost skin on the hands. Clearly, it's different from mechanical stimulation. In this case, it's optical, it's light stimulation, but flows across the hand are probably the better way of conceiving flows of optical texture across the eyes. Okay, I wanted to make sure we kind of had that in our mind now as we think about the stimulation not being simulative, right? When we think about those flows across the hand of these sort of things, there's not really a simulation here. There's more texture. There's not really a simulation of the objects in this stimulation. It's a flow, right? It doesn't look like that flow doesn't look like the object that we're touching. And that's the way to think about optical information. It is much more abstract than a photograph or a quasi-photograph of the thing that's out in the world. It is a flow, like it's flowing across our hands. That's how we should think about this information in the eyes. That's how we should think about specificational information. And I think this is a nice example. This kind of makes it very intuitive for a lot of people. It's an example I call the brink. And the idea is this. Imagine somebody is walking around campus. I don't think you folks have had a lot of experience with the campus, but I can vouch for this. There are places on campus that you'll walk around and all of a sudden you'll come to basically like a little cliff that's, was actually architecturally, designed where you realize that you're either going to have to do a little jump or you're going to have to find the stairs because you can't go down easy. So there's places like this. In the commons, you could be walking around and you say, I'm going to take a shortcut and walk through the grass. And all of a sudden there's a part of the commons that kind of goes down fairly steeply where you realize you can't just step down. You have to either jump down or you have to find, as I said, the stairs nearby or something like that. It's kind of odd. I mean, it's cool looking, but it's not always the easiest thing to traverse. So it makes sense to stay on the stairs or to follow the concrete or something like that. Another part on campus, which I love to discuss because it's so strange, is the arts building. So when you guys, in June, when we get our vaccines, go back to campus and go to the fine arts building, where the music department and all that's there. You can walk around outside there and all of a sudden you think you're kind of I try to find an office, try just to find a target location there but kind of go in from the outside. You can walk around there and all of a sudden realize, oh my gosh, I'm trapped. Either I have to jump down and could possibly hurt my knees, or I have to kind of wriggle down with my butt. It looks cool, but it isn't always the easiest space to traverse. It's a really interesting example of this. But the cool thing is when you come up to these brinks, whether it's at the Commons or at the Arts Building, that pretty quickly, it's like, oh boy, I've got to either, I don't think I can step off of this anymore. I've got to either jump, I've got to wriggle down, I've got to slide down on my butt, or I've got to, I don't know, find another way to walk down, get a ladder or something like that. Do some rappelling. Yeah, bring your rappelling equipment to the Arts Building. And we know that as we get closer to that edge, okay, so imagine, we're talking about a cliff here in this case, it's a little cliff. But as you get closer to the edge of that cliff, okay, readily whether it's a cliff you can step over, or you have to hop down, or you have to, kind of slide down on your butt, or you probably shouldn't even do it at all and find another way to get down. Okay, the older I get, the more I go for the stairs. So that is information you have available to you. As you're coming up to that edge, what the height of this surface is, and I'm just labeling it H. So here's the surface that you're judging in a way, right here, because you have to determine how high this is, okay, in order to know whether you can in fact step down. If it's just stairs, that's what you'll do, right? Or jump down if it's more than stairs, or slide down on your butt, all those sort of things. You are perceiving the height of this surface. Okay? You are perceiving that height in order to know how to navigate it. Okay? Well, how are you perceiving the height of that surface? Think about it. As you're coming up to that surface, you are not getting any light reflected from that surface to your eye. Okay? Wherever the light source is, up on top, we have a sun up here or whatever, the light is going to come down to the surface and reflect off going this way. Okay, oops, all right, going this way, right, all down here. But there is no light that reflects off the surface H that goes to your eye. Still, you have information about the height of H. You have information about H that's, very useful, reliable, and, for most of us, we won't make mistakes and know whether to step or to hop or to slide our butts or to rappel down. Okay. How is that information there? Well, that information is there in a more abstract form of the flow across our retinas, such that, okay, this is the example I call the brink, such that the rate that the lower surface is revealed is in fact specific to the height of that surface. Okay, here's what I mean by this. If you want to do this at home, you're not embarrassing yourself in front of your friends and family, what you can do is you can put the surface that you're walking on, would be this upper hand here, and the surface you're going to have to jump, step, or rappel down to is your other hand. And as you move forward towards the edge of that brink, you'll see the rate at which the lower hand's texture is revealed will depend on how high the brink is, that height of the surface that we're not getting light reflected from. Okay, so if it's a shallow surface, I see the texture that is revealed of the lower hand is a little bit slower. If it's a higher surface, though, as I move forward, the texture is revealed more quickly. Now, it is in fact specific. The rate at which the texture is being revealed, the lower surface's texture is being revealed, is specific to the height of H, if in fact one other thing is considered, and that's the relative rate at which the texture from the higher hand is decreted or is hidden as you're moving forward. So it's actually a tiny bit more complicated than what I've listed there, but that's okay. The rate at which that lower hand's texture is revealed relative to the upper hand's occluded texture is going to tell you something about the height. Okay, so you're perceiving a property, a true real-world property, which is the height of H, without having light reflected from H available to your eye. The information is much more abstract than just a copy of that surface H. It's in the relative rate of the uncovering of this texture and the occluding of this texture as you're moving across it. That's going to tell you information. So right there you have specificational, reliable, trustworthy, lawfully based information that doesn't involve light reflected from that object to the eye. The information is in the relative, I guess you could say, accretion and deletion of texture, occlusion and disocclusion of texture. It's a much more abstract type of informational form than a photograph is going to give you. Okay? It doesn't look like it. This is a flow of texture on the retina based on the light reflecting from the upper surface and the lower surface. So this is an example I really like because I think it really makes it intuitive how the type of information that Gibson is looking for is not simulative information. Okay? It's not going to look like the thing that actually is being perceived. We're not getting any light reflected off of H, but we're able to perceive H accurately, okay? Because it's specified in the rates of a texture revealed down here and occluded up here as we move forward, okay? So what Gibson's going to do is absolutely reject this idea of a simulative assumption. Absolutely reject it, saying we should not be looking at information as copies of things in the light that resemble things in the world. No, the information is not going to resemble the world. I mean, in the sense that, you're not going to see copies of things in the world in the light that kind of is the basis of the perceptual process. That information is going to be much more abstract. That's the type of information that the visual system has evolved to detect, this abstract information that doesn't look like the thing in the world. Okay? It is reliable, it is useful, it's fully informative, but it's not like a snapshot. Okay? And so it's the idea that objects are going to, and their surfaces are going to structure light. And so light is considered to be something that's more structured than an image. It's, again, another way to reject this kind of photography sort of metaphor, and that the eye is capturing images, kind of small versions of the world. It's like hands. The eyes are like hands exploring texture as the light texture is kind of flowing across them. Okay, that's what the visual system is really after. Okay, objects and their surfaces in the world structure light, but that light is detected by eyes that are sensitive to flows of texture across them. Okay. Another way I like to talk about this is through an old kind of concept that's discussed in various movies. Actually, there was a new version, which I haven't seen. I've seen two versions of the old Invisible Man. There is the original one with Claude Rains from the 50s, I think, 40s maybe. And then there's one with Kevin Bacon. And then there's one that came out with Kate, what's her name? Oh God, I can't remember her name. Oh, the great actress, great young actress. Not Kate Moss. Kate Moss is a model, right? I have to look it up. Oh, Elizabeth Moss. That's it. Elizabeth Moss. Yeah, great actress. She was in a version last year. I don't know if any of you folks saw it. Supposedly it was pretty good. It's a kind of a horror movie where, her husband, I guess, finds some way of becoming invisible. He's a scientist. Most scientists are that close to invisibility. I don't know. But, basically he kind of, tortures her through, because he's evil. The Claude Rains version, though, the original version from the 50s, is much more charming, and you've probably seen stills from this if you haven't actually seen the movie itself. The Invisible Man, in order to be visible, what he'll do is he wears a trench coat and sunglasses and a hat and ace bandages. You've probably seen him. Okay, and that Invisible Man is actually more kind-hearted. Little nuts, but it's he's not evil like the more recent ones. And there's this one scene where he is hiding from the police because they believe he did something. And he's, I think, at a friend's house, and he has all of his Invisible Man clothing on, so we can see him in the movie. But then the police start knocking on the door, and he realizes he has to get out. And how does he get out? Well, he's going to, become invisible. So he takes off all his clothing, and he's just going to run out the back door as the police are at the front door. And it's great. It's a great scene because he runs out the back door, and then all of a sudden realizes it's raining. And once he steps into the rain, his body, which is still, still has mass and texture to it and all that sort of stuff, doesn't structure light, it structures the rain. And then all of a sudden he's visible. It actually, the special effects during that scene, I should probably see if I can get a clip of that, are really quite beautiful given, what they had to work with. All of a sudden he's invisible in the house after he takes his clothes off. He's invisible as he's running out the back door. But once he gets outside, he becomes visible. And the idea here is that, it's not, it's not like, we're talking about light images here. We're talking about how objects and their surfaces structure a medium. In that case, it was rain. But in the case of, most of our experience with objects as visual beings is a structure of light. So the idea that objects and their surfaces structure light, I think, is something that's very different from how we've been discussing things as objects kind of being simulated in the light. Here we're talking about a structuring of light. And I think the Invisible Man story is kind of a nice way of thinking about that. And then, so what does this do to ideas of sensation and perception? And what Gibson's going to do here is he's going to suggest that the notion of sensation as being the start of perception is misguided. That, sensations in the sense that, well, first we detect light, we detect properties of light, and then we kind of build up our perceptual experience from there, is rejected. Okay, he's going to say that the information, since it is so rich, doesn't involve kind of a building from low-level properties. Instead, think about, the kind of complex properties that are available in the light or on our skin as we touch things, right? And those patterns, okay, across the retina, you can ask people to detect lights and stuff like that, but that's not what the brain's set up to do. What the perceiver's set up to do is to detect structured textures moving across the retinas, okay, moving across the retinas. And so everything that's needed is in that texture. It's not like it's being built up from scratch. And kind of to give us intuitive examples, there are certainly examples where we can show that we're not getting sensation, where we are getting perception. And this Brink example is exactly that. We are not getting a sensation from this surface, right? There is no sensation from this surface because there's no light that's reflecting off that surface that's going to our eye. Okay? There's nothing that is going from reflecting off the surface to our eye. So there's no sensation of the surface, but we are perceiving it. So he's calling that sensationless perception, right? Perceiving solidity in some ways involves sensationless perception. When I perceive, this book, okay, when I perceive this book, I'm not perceiving its solidity, or I'm not perceiving the back of it. There's no light that's reflecting off the back of it, but I am perceiving its solidity, and that is because there's information for solidity in the way I'm moving relative to that book, all the texture gradients that I'm detecting at the same time. So, we have sensationless perception in some ways all the time. And then other examples, yeah, they're kind of, more kind of extreme examples, but we can have examples where we experience a sensation and don't have a perception. We call this perceptionless sensation, in the sense that, we can have light stimulus to the eyes, like in the laboratory, where we're not really perceiving objects at all. We're just kind of detecting light, or if we're in a fog. There's other kind of laboratory examples of this. And these aren't really as important in some ways, but the important part is that he's trying to separate sensation as not being a part of the perceptual process. Sensory psychophysics is something you can do in the laboratory. That's fine. Maybe you can measure sensitivities of the eye to low-level energy. That's okay. Same with the ear and the skin and all that stuff. But if you're doing so to try to uncover the building blocks of perception, you're doing it the wrong way, Gibson would say. Gibson does more or less reject sensory psychophysics as a method to understand perception. Okay, that's a little radical, and certainly, colleagues, across the world to say no, that's you get in arguments all the time. So I do sensory psychophysics in my laboratory, and this is how we understand how the eye starts its processing, and you say no. That is kind of a byproduct. The fact that people are able to do this is kind of a byproduct of the perceptual operation that involves detecting complex information, not low-level information. And I don't actually have this on the slide, but I'm going to tell you this story, this concept just very quickly. There's a theory of sensory psychophysics called the physical correlate theory. I used to do I used to have a few slides on this. I don't include it anymore because it's now a very old theory, but I think it still is interesting, and it is relevant, I think, to Gibson. What that theory says is that when you ask people to make judgments of sensory properties, say the brightness of a light, the loudness of a sound, okay? They're not going to, of course, go right along with the amount of energy, right? It's not, as you know, it's it's kind of a logarithmic sort of relationship between the sensory experience of how loud a sound is and the energy of that sound. You folks know that from your old, Fechner stuff and all that. When you look at that, what you're really seeing in those relationships between sensory experience and physical energy is the subject actually making judgments about a physical property in the world. So, when somebody makes a judgment of how loud a sound is, as the scientist is turning up or turning down the amplitude of the sound in the lab, what they're really judging, kind of inadvertently, is what happens to sound as you change the distance from you. So, this works nicely, actually. When somebody says that a sound has gotten half as loud as it was, what it ends up corresponding to is what happens when you move the same sound source twice as far away from a person. Okay, so let's make sure we understand this. This is pretty profound. How does this work? We'll do a method of adjustment. Remember those? Okay, here's the sound. Bzzz, or beep, make it a beep. And okay, that's a loud sound. Make it half as loud now. So I turn it down. I'm turning it down. That's about half as loud. Beep. Okay, do it one more time. Start with the loud one. Beep, beep. That's about half as loud. As it turns out, when they make those sort of judgments, they're turning down the sound so it reflects what the sound would sound like if it was twice as far away from them. Okay, the same thing with light. Okay, here's a bright light now I'm seeing. Actually, I'm seeing bright lights here in the garage. If I'm asked to now make it half as bright, what I will do is I'll make an adjustment that seems half as bright to me, but inadvertently, without knowing this, I am adjusting the light so it would have the brightness that corresponded as if the light was now twice as far away from me. So what these folks are arguing, and I think this is consistent with Gibson to some degree, that when you kind of force people to make sensory judgments, they're still kind of relying on environmental, niche relevant properties. Okay? It's insightful. And Gibson would say, yeah, I'm not surprised, because it's kind of a byproduct. Being able to make sensory judgments on pure light or pure sound is not what the animal has been designed to do. But if they, in fact, show that it's twice as far away, that's twice as loud and twice as bright, yeah, I'm not surprised. That it's a byproduct of perception. Sensation is not the building block of perception for Gibson. So you remember that kind of set of box flow charts that we had that started with the environment, went to the receptor and sensation. He's saying, we're getting rid of sensation if you mean the building blocks of perception. Yeah, there's light on the eye, there's sound in the ear and all that stuff. But what is important is the complex structure of the stimulation on the receptor surfaces. And that complex structure is what's going to tell the perceiver about the world. Okay? If you have any questions, feel free to stop me. But if not, I'm going to...
I have a real quick question.
Sure.
So I think in this example, we are not perceiving like the vertical surface, right? We're just perceiving the height, right?
Right. Yes. Oh, yeah. You're absolutely right. So say that vertical surface had an image of me. That from now on, all vertical surfaces have to have a picture of Rosenblum on them. You would not know that, but you are certainly perceiving a property. You are certainly perceiving a property of that object, right? A critical property, the most behaviorally relevant property given the context, and that's important. So yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. Gibson would say, you're not perceiving every property of an object. You're perceiving a behaviorally relevant property in this case. And if you wanted to see that image of Rosenblum, that mural of Rosenblum on that surface, you're going to have to look at it from another angle. That's fine. Yeah. It is still a property, and it is a reliable property based on this kind of abstract form of the information. Yeah, absolutely true.
Yeah. So like maybe we can reconcile the two theories by, separate perception into two kinds. Right? One is called primary perception, and one is called secondary perception. And
Okay.
maybe like the perception of heights is secondary, but maybe like the perception of mass or weight can be, maybe it can be like primary because we don't need any textual information, right? So the older series can still be applied to that kind of perceptions.
Okay. Yep, I understand your point. However, just to anticipate where we're going to be in about 15, 20 minutes of this discussion, Gibson's going to say that the behaviorally relevant properties are the primary properties. Okay, where something like I don't know. I'm not sure exactly what you meant by the primary property before. The other sorts of things are secondary, like like the image of Rosenblum's face or something like that. What we need is the primary properties are the things that are going to support the most important behavioral, kind of the basic
Oh,
behavioral repertoire of the animal. Okay.
yeah.
So that's going to be primary, and that actually is going to get what's going to be able to get us to this dual descriptors thing, the incommensurability sort of thing. This is what's going to get us there. But I understand what you're saying. So can we apply kind of a computation or a constructionist sort of perspective to many of these things, and an ecological perspective to things that are kind of secondary? Gibson's going to say, if anything, it's just reversed. That the things that are primary, the things that are the things that are most behaviorally relevant, and that's where the real lawful information, specificational information, should be found. Okay. Okay. Cool.
I have one quick question.
Yeah.
Specifically about your, we were just talking about the light differences or sound differences and distance.
Yeah.
In that example, so both are just like wavelengths, frequency differences.
Yes.
So if the only thing you're changing is the amplitude, I guess, how else would you perceive something other than just associating it to distance? Like I see how that's a good example
Right.
of how distance is always being applied, but if there's no other change, what else are we supposed to think other than just like,
Well,
okay,
I mean,
the difference is distance?
it could, there's certainly counter arguments to the physical correlate theory that have to do with, I can't remember, it's been a long time, things that are just inherent in the nervous system, number of neurons that are firing or something like that. I mean, I'm just making things up, but there are other explanations where the kind of environmental correlate is not considered to be something that's relevant to the kind of sensory sensitivities of the eye or the ear. I mean, the fact that there's anything environmentally relevant to those at all, I think came as a surprise to a lot of people, right? Because it's like, the ear has this kind of curve of sensitivity, this kind of psychophysical function of sensitivity, and they looked for neurophysiological reasons why it had that. And certainly, I mean, some of it makes sense. So you want to compress at one end. You don't want to damage the organ, so it's going to compress when things are really loud, and it's going to expand when things are really quiet, and all that sort of stuff. But the detailed nature of that curve that's being related to an environmental property, I think that was radical, at least at the time. See what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, I think I get it.
Yeah.
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 I was just thinking like you're still just perceiving waves, and it could be explained that you're you're just putting distance on it because that's what we're most comfortable with, or that's like the metric that we uh, um, kind of perceive better
Yeah.
than
Well,
these small wavelength incremental differences.
yeah, no, that's exactly, I think, what the theory says, is that when a subject is put in a position to have to do pure sensory judgments, which is something we don't typically do, right? That's not something that, my doggy can do, animals can do. They're not put in a situation where they have to judge twice energy or discriminations of pure lights or pure sounds or something like that. They fall back on environmental properties. And that was considered radical at the time.
I'm thinking of, maybe it's just the pattern of the wave changing is different.
Oh, it
Like,
absolutely. Oh, it's definitely related to the what is it called, the inverse square law, right? So the inverse square law is, as an object moves away, its energy changes at the inverse square of the distance and all that. It's yeah. I mean, it's not important, the details, but it's true of light energy. It's true of sound energy. It's true of space in general. But the fact that would drive sensory sensitivities, which are not supposed to have any sort of, environmental relevance to them in a way, that even at that level there is an environmental relevance, I think surprised a lot of people back in the day. So, you understand what I'm saying? People did not think that curve, that kind of idiosyncratic curve of sensitivity, the Fechner's law and all that stuff, or Stevens law, was based on anything to do with an environmental property. They thought it had to do with, nervous system properties, the peripheral nervous system, that sort of stuff.
So this kind of gets into kind of a chicken and the egg question, though, because if we're shaped by our environment and our environment has shaped us, or our ancestors in evolution,
Right.
then
Yeah, no, absolutely.
which
Yeah.
is which?
Right, absolutely. That, it's not surprising when you think about it, that when people are again put into a kind of odd situation of having to judge energy, they're not judging distance in any of these. They're judging energy, light, double the brightness, double the sound, loudness, that sort of thing, that they'll rely on environmental properties. In retrospect, it seems pretty intuitive. But again, it was not considered to be something, when people, if they are trained, can make pure sensitivity judgments to energy, and it should not be according to any sort of environmental property. I think maybe it doesn't sound that surprising now because it's intuitive, but back then it was very surprising. We're talking about the 80s, I think this thing came out. Yeah. Okay. Anything else? All right, this is a good place to take a break then. Let's do that and come back in 10 minutes and continue to talk about this stuff. Okay, see you. Okay. Oh, there's some chat questions. Let's see. Oh, I'm so excited when I get chat questions. All right. Predictions. Okay. Um, let's see. Is Mac back? Mac, are you with us? Mac asked a couple of questions. There you are. Hello. So, why are we not first perceiving the information from different modalities like time and size, and then combine them to make inferences about the height? Oh, I see. So, okay. So you're talking about the brink, I think, right? You're talking about the brink example, right, Mac? Um, so
Yeah.
maybe, okay, so I understand what you're asking, but let me just make sure I get the whole question. So maybe in this way, this process is not a perceptual process, it's just making an inference and maybe testing our predictions, right? So what Gibson would say is that there's no reason to extract out those lower level dimensions of time and size. That is absolutely irrelevant. I mean, the scientists can do that, right? The physicists can do that. But as you're going to see, we're going to reject that as a basis for perception. Why not just have the animal detect the information that's going to be, available without doing those low-level calculations? If the information is specificational, what would be the point of doing the low-level calculations? That's, I think, what he would say.
Yeah, but why we are talking about the reason? It seems like pretty weird. Like, why do we need a reason for that? But yeah, I like, yeah, I know what you are talking about. Like,
Right.
yeah, because it's not necessary for us to start from the low level stuff, right?
Right.
Yeah, but maybe we are just really starting from that low level stuff. We don't know that, right?
Well, if that's the case, you would expect people to be as good with the low-level stuff as they are with the behavioral stuff, maybe? And they're not, right? Clearly they're not. They're terrible when they're asked to make those sort of judgments, right? That was one of Gibson's points in terms of the methodology, that when you ask people to make height judgments, when you ask people to make time judgments, they're awful. When you ask people to make behaviorally relevant judgments, they're amazing, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, that's part of the methodology, that when you ask people to judge how far an object is away from you, in terms of meters or in terms of inches or any sort of metric you want to make, they're awful. If you ask them whether they can reach something, they're perfect, right? So yeah, right. That in and of itself is not evidence that they're not using lower level properties. But the other argument against the lower level properties, besides the fact that people stink at it, is that you would want to do away with that if, in fact, you could find properties in the information itself that could always specify that type of thing, that could always be informative about that type of thing. Then to have people do those lower level, I mean, think about where the lower level dimensions assumption comes from, this idea of this incommensurability of natural kinds, right? That the real world is measured in physics, the behavioral world is measured in mental sorts of properties, right? Well, he's going to end up rejecting that too, and saying that the real world that's relevant to animals' behavior should be measured in a different way, a physical way, an absolutely grounded physical way, but it doesn't have to be measured in absolute time or absolute heights or absolute distances or anything like that. The environment can be described in a physical way that is relevant to animals' behaviors and perceptions. And if that's the case, then there's no reason for the brain to have to go through that lower level sort of analysis. Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah, we're going to build this up. So you're asking great questions, and the answers aren't completely available with everything I've discussed, but they should become more available as we continue.
I have one quick one before we move on. So we're really good with this like texture gradient thing.
Right.
Why would that not be enough for the brink scenario? I mean, I understand that the speed at which the lower level is revealed is
Yeah.
great. Don't get
Yeah.
me wrong. But it
Yeah.
seems like if I
Yeah.
can see the other one and the texture is
Yeah.
vastly different, that should be enough for me to be able to make a judgment
Yeah.
on
Yeah. Yeah. And
how
that
far.
actually is something that's often discussed as being available. Actually, if you look in most perceptual textbooks, that talk about texture gradients, they'll have one example where you actually do see a brink. You see texture up here, you see texture down there, and the kind of the disjointedness at that point would be considered a brink and potentially something that could be perceived. That's fine, but still do consider, the reason I use that example is because it's so time dependent. And I really, really want to emphasize that texture gradients are all that if that is something that's detected, that is detected not through any sort of simulative assumption, is detected through, again, flows of texture across the eyes. That's fine. It could absolutely be something like that, but the information for it is still going to be abstract. Okay. I am always hesitant to go through the texture gradient example. I often do it in undergraduate classes because it kind of just, it's a way of kind of discussing the ecologizing of the problem by putting the animal back on the ground plane and all that. But it is in some ways kind of a more simulative photographic sort of example, and Gibson wouldn't want that, really. Texture gradients are an important part for Gibson, but again, they are available in the time-dependent information that's flowing across the retina. And so that's why I go for the accretion, relative accretion and deletion rates for that example. Yeah. But you're absolutely right. Yeah, potentially.
Yeah, and of course, both of them are very informative. So.
Right. And abstract. Right. And an example where you're actually not detecting light from the surface that you're perceiving a reliable property from. Yep. Good. It's great. You guys are thinking well. All righty. Any other questions before we continue on this? I think I'm good here. Yes. All right. All righty. So yeah, we're gonna reconceive of light a little bit from this perspective. So this is what Gibson would call ecological optics, and some of this I think it's important stuff to go through just to kind of to reconsider the stimulus even further. Again, the main goal here is to find ways in which the stimulus can be conceived in the form that might show it's completely informative to what's in the world. And for that purpose, Gibson does go through kind of a reconception of how to think of optics, not from a physical kind of, the perspective in the sense that, what you would learn about optics in a physics class, but in an animal relevant way. So as we start talking about this, as we go through kind of descriptions of input, descriptions of perception from an animal relevant perspective, it's important to keep this in mind, and we will come back to this again and again. By talking about an ecological optics, Gibson is not going to add any mental component in here at all. There is nothing intentional, representational, or mental. This is physics, but he wants to kind of describe the physics as it's relevant to animal perception and behavior. Okay, so there's nothing non-physical about this. This is as grounded as other physics, but there's other ways you can describe it, right? So as the example, light typically from what you would call physical optics, like the optics you would take and learn about in an optics class in the physics department, is usually a physics of luminous bodies like light bulbs and light sources. And you study radiation from that luminous body and the nature of how that light works, whether it's, going through prisms and all that sort of stuff, the breaking down the light based on waveforms and all that sort of stuff. That is typically what you study in physical optics. But what Gibson's saying is that, yeah, that's useful for physical optics. It's useful for understanding light sources and waves and all that sort of stuff. But it really isn't that useful for understanding how animals use the light that's available to them in the environment. Okay? And that's where he comes up with this term ecological optics, in which, light sources are useful to the animal only insofar that they actually create reflected light. That's really what the animal is dealing with, is reflected light. Light that certainly comes from a light bulb or comes from the sun, a skylight, whatever, but then critically is structured by the surfaces that the animal is interacting with. Right? Animals rarely actually interact with light sources, they interact with light reflectors. And so he'll discuss things such as illuminated bodies and illumination and ambient light. What ambient light is here is, what he's talking about here is the light that is kind of bouncing around based on the reflections of the surfaces of any space. So on the beach, for example, the light source is mainly the sun. But what I'm perceiving, I'll perceive the sun, but that's really kind of irrelevant. What I perceive, what I interact with, is the palm tree and the sand and the sea, and the way I'm able to perceive those things and ultimately interact with those things is from the light reflected from the surfaces of those objects. And that's the light that he really wants to kind of think about describing in a way that's relevant to animals. And he's going to do this in kind of an interesting way, this idea of ambient light, reflected light kind of bouncing all around the animal. He's going to talk about it in terms of an array. This is a kind of classic Gibson term, the ambient optic array. And there's different ways of considering the ambient optic array. But one thing that is going to be absolutely critical is to realize that when light is structured by surfaces in a natural environment, there is structure. Self-evident, right? There is structure. And the structure will be dependent on some important properties of what's in the array. So that little eye there is getting structured light from reflected, that's taking the form of reflected light from the surface of the tabletop and the surface of the table leg and the floor, the ground plane. The truck that's outside is reflecting light through a window in this case, and the walls that are around the window are reflecting light, right? So there is structure. Also look at how the array in that image is defined. It's not just defined by the reflected surfaces. It's defined by the eye itself. It is defined, before I get to that, it is defined by the eye here. So what's reflected, the kind of ambient array, optic array, is going to be different if the eye is up here, or if the eye's outside, or if the eye's hiding down here. Okay? There's still structure to it, okay? But it is different. And so this ambient optic array is going to be structured not just by the surfaces that are reflecting light, but where the point of observation is. And I'm just calling it a point of observation here. I'm going to be very, very neutral about it because I don't want you to even consider the optics of the eye, let alone the nervous system or any sort of, intent or interpretation or mental process that might be behind it. Drop that out. And let's just talk about the physical optics, in this case, the ecological optics involved in defining the reflectances of surfaces and a point of observation. There's my dumb point of observation. Okay, it's not even an eye. I'm just defining, okay, so make it even more precise. There's our point of observation. It's not an eye. It's not a nervous system. It's not a psychological, mental being that has intent. Drop all that out. we're talking about physics. In this case, it's an ecological physics, clearly, because we're going to include a position where ultimately an animal is going to go. But all the light can be described without anything but that. And he defines something called the visual solid angle. And it's kind of a fancy term for basically the light that's reflected off of a surface and kind of has an angle that has its apex at a point of observation. Okay, so why is it's solid, by the way? It's three-dimensional. The way we're defining the light, right? It's three-dimensional coming off the tabletop, for example. It comes, the visual solid angle for the tabletop is defined by the surface of the tabletop from this position and the point of observation. Okay, and it is three-dimensional in the sense that it's solid. So, this is a kind of cross-section, but if you were sitting in front of a table, as you probably are right now, it is a kind of a cone that comes from the surface of that table to where your point of observation is. It's this very point at moment, which is, one of your eyes. Okay, so it's critical that this be something that's going to define a new description of the relevant optics for perception and behavior. These visual solid angles are defined by the surface of whatever objects are in your immediate environment and the point of observation. Just meaning that ultimately that's going to be a position where an eye could occupy, but we're making no assumptions about anything to do with anything psychological or neurophysiological. It's just a point. Okay. What else? Oh, nested. Yeah, I can say that. These things are nested within each other, these visual solid angles, just meaning that, and if you look back at this figure, it might be easiest, that the base that encompasses the, the wall and floor includes inside at the tabletop, if there's something on the tabletop, say a laptop like what you folks might have right now, there's a visual solid angle whose base is the surfaces of the laptop. Again, the apex, the point being your point of observation, but that's nested inside the visual solid angle of the tabletop, which is nested inside the visual solid angle defined by the wall and the floor and all that sort of stuff. So it's nested. But the important thing is to think of the optics, in an ecological sense, that first, it's dealing with reflected light, where the reflections are defined by the surfaces of the objects. And secondly, and as importantly, it's defined by the point of observation. Okay? Light is structured to be specific to the layout of surfaces and the point of observation. And my gardener's here, of course. The important part is trying to make a move towards understanding how the stimulus can be considered to be described in a way that is specific to the environment and, I don't know if that's as loud for you as it is for me. It's specific to the environment and potentially the animal's place in the environment. So it's not just going to be doing an analysis of an environment, right? This is an ecological move without reference to an animal. We are including the animal, but nothing to do with the animal's psychology, just a point of observation where an animal can occupy. So again, this is a part of this move that we've been continuing to do from the Gibsonian perspective, which is to reject this doctrine of intractable non-specificity. Isn't it, in a sense, kind of the primary move that Gibson wants to do? He wants to see if we can find specific information that can tell the, perceptual systems about the world, right? And that's terrific if it works, right? But one of the moves he's making is to redefine optics from an ecological perspective. And it's nothing less physical. It's just concentrating on different parts of what's in the physical world, what's out there and available to the optics. Nothing psychological in here, nothing mysterious in here. Let's not talk about luminous bodies and radiation and radiant light. Let's talk about reflected light. Let's talk about ambient light and things that are illuminated. And let's also consider the fact that that light structure is defined not just by the reflecting surfaces, but by a point of observation that's going to be occupied in that ambient optic array. And that's a really, really important notion, because now we're thinking of light as being something defined by the natural environment and the animal's place in the natural environment. Okay, that's going to be something that's defining the important specificational information, right? We've already seen this, right? We've already seen this in the context of a moving point of observation when I was saying during optical flow, right? That is telling, that is information. That first example was information, specificational information that considered, in fact, that was created by something that point of observation was doing. It was moving. But now here's another instance where now we're getting a little bit more formal about that, and we're incorporating the point of observation in the description of the physical optics that's ecologically relevant. Okay. If you have any questions, feel free to stop me. Oh boy, there was something else I was going to say. I thought of something during the break that I was going to kind of tie things in with, and I can't. Hopefully it'll come back to me as I'm talking. Okay. Again, I want to emphasize here that there's nothing really that radical about this slide. There really isn't. I mean, what's radical, of course, is the idea that we're going to try to make the input specificational. But this description here is not, it's not something that's non-physical, right? There's nothing, mysterious or mental or ghost in the machine having to do with any of these things at all. It is just a way of redescribing what the physical optics might be in a way that's more relevant without anything, psychological. Okay, I just want to make that very clear. All right, now we're going to go to this concept of invariants, and what invariants are basically what we've been talking about. We have been talking about input that is going to be taken kind of from a higher order perspective. Kind of, maybe the example we can run with now is the cliff. The cliff. And so basically it's just, we're giving now a name. An invariant is the name we'll give to the proximal stimulation that we've been discussing, that is much more abstract than something like a simulation or a photograph. So basically we can just define an invariant as a higher order pattern of proximal stimulation that is going to be specificational relative to perceptual properties, that corresponds to perceptual properties. So we're just giving a name for things like this global flow and the relative accretion and deletion, and maybe the texture gradients, disjointed texture gradients that were brought up. We're looking at information that is not photographic, that is not simulative. It is in fact more abstract. It's relational, right? It's relational. That was an important thing that we were discussing before. And this is going to be intuitive, I think, for you. It just kind of helps us kind of move along the story a little bit. Oh, look at that guy. Let me stop this while you're seeing him talk. I'll go back to him. We're going to break these down into two kind of categories of invariants. Basically, it is these are different types of invariants that can provide information for different types of environmental properties. One's going to be called a structural invariant. And basically, this is going to be kind of these higher ordered patterns of stimulation on, say, the retina, that can give information about the invariant structure of the world. And so here's kind of where the invariant term becomes really useful. So far I've kind of defined what it is in this context, but what makes it invariant? And one way to think about this is to think about the old perceptual constancies. Remember this? I think I have this term. Yeah, I do. Perceptual constancies of things like size constancy, brightness constancy, shape constancy. Okay, so we perceive that door as a rectangular shape, even though the image, okay, if we're going from an imaginal sort of, kind of simulative sort of description, the image changes on the retina, right? When we open a door, when a door is closed, and we're looking at it from a straight on. If we were to take a picture of it, it would seem be like a rectangular projection on the eye. I'm kind of going, back to kind of classic theories that we've already discussed. But then as you open it, what happens? Well, that shape changes as something on the eye. It becomes trapezoidal or whatever, then it becomes completely, kind of a vertical line as it's all the way opened. But we're able to perceive that door as something that is constant in shape. How? Well, classically, from a more kind of structuralist, computationalist, or certainly even connectionist sort of perspective, we would say that there is, some sort of distance and perspective sort of thing that's taken into account. So the measurement of the door has to be offset by all these sort of things if you take the stimulus as the door itself. The same thing with size and brightness. When you turn up and down the lights, things still seem to, have the same colors more or less. And as we move closer and further, size might be the most intuitive to us because we spent time with it when we were discussing the inference making process in the very beginning, right? As something moves away from us, its retinal image size decreases, but its object size doesn't seem to change. Why is that? Well, we take into account the other cues. What Gibson's going to say is the perceptual constancies become a problem for the brain to solve only if you assume that the input is measured in kind of a Euclidean space, and in the sense that it's measured, as if we're giving a simple kind of graphic description to a kind of photographic or simulative image input. And he's saying that that's not necessarily how the perceptual systems work. Instead, we can consider that the perceptual systems have a more flexible sort of geometry as they're kind of analyzing it. First, of course, we're talking about information for something like a door or something like the distance of something that's going to incorporate relative sorts of properties between texture gradients. But of course, in addition to that, we're talking about texture that's moving across the retina. But even beyond that, okay, the eye doesn't need to be making measurements of objects in the same way we might make measurements as we take out rulers and graph things on paper and all that sort of stuff, right? There's lots of different types of geometry that the visual system can, measure things in or can use to maintain that something is actually the same size. Okay, and so there's no time at which it actually is a trapezoidal shape, because raw shape is not something that the visual system is detecting. It's detecting flows, and it can be detecting these in geometries that are not like the sort of Euclidean geometries we might have on a piece of paper or something like that. So what structural invariants pretty much are ways in which we perceive objects as maintaining their structure through certain types of perceptual or stimulus properties that actually remain invariant across different changes. So it's the perceptual psychologist's job to find out what is happening in this abstract stimulus that's not changing in order for the perceiver to perceive non-changing properties of objects. So the flow field we've been talking about, there are properties, this kind of the global nature of this kind of flowing texture across the retinas is something that's invariant from time to time to time. And that's something that's been, that scientists have discovered that can show, yeah, there are properties. They're not like images at all, but there are properties of this flow across the retina that's going to explain why, we're able to perceive our self motion in all of these instances. These are invariant properties of the stimulus. So it isn't just it's not just the job of the ecological psychologist to say, well, the information is abstract, it's really hard to find. The Gibsonians need to go in and actually find what is invariant about the information that allows an object to be perceived as non-changing in size, brightness, and shape. So that's one of the goals of the whole enterprise, is to find the invariant aspects of it. Just be very aware that those invariant aspects of it are not going to be like an image. They are not going to be like a simulation. That's a structural invariant. Transformational invariants are just the same sorts of things, but for kind of things that are changing, properties that are actually changing, but are changing in ways that are invariant from time to time. So actually the global flow example I gave you just a few seconds back is probably an example of a transformational invariant, because it is a very specific change in a point of observation moving in an environment, and that change is something that is invariantly specified in all of these different instances because of that property of global flow. So that's probably better characterized as a transformational invariant, that type of information in the optic array. Okay, so we're talking about styles of change, and this actually other great examples of these are the point light examples I gave before. And this gives me a chance to talk a little bit about that research too. So there's something in the transformations of this example right here that allow the perceiver to be able to perceive certain aspects about what these people are doing. The fact that people can be recognized at all, I guess, would be an example of information, structural invariance providing information for structural properties of the objects. But there's also information about what they're doing. They're moving, they're dancing. And there's some great examples of this. So for example, weight curling. With these point light actors, in one great demonstration, the actors are asked to lift different amounts of weight, and then in some instances are asked to pretend to mime lifting heavy weights when the weight is light, and lifting light weights when the weight is actually heavy. And people, unless it's a professional mime, people are really good at seeing through that. And the nice thing about that, I mean, not only is it kind of make this kind of cool point that this kind of isolated kind of transformational information can be used to perceive, specific aspects of weights, lifted and all that stuff. And even when weight lifted is trying to fool you, right? But it also allows a really nice kind of way to analyze what in the motion is providing that. And it turns out to be something, pretty abstract. It's cool, right? It has to do with how the rate changes as somebody brings the weight to the top. And there's ways of kind of analyzing that, so that there is a transformational invariant in that light that allows the perceiver to tell something very specific about that action. So if you want to go to the papers, you'll see that it has to do with how the deceleration occurs at the top and then accelerates back down. That's something that can't be faked and is really dependent on the weight. But that's just one example, and that would be an example of a transformational invariant, that is something that tells the perceiver from time to time again. It's an invariant about the physical transformation that's actually occurring. There's great examples of these. Something. I'm gonna actually skip this next concept. Yeah, I'm gonna skip this next concept. But the other example I wanted to talk about, since we do it in our lab, is this works with faces as well. This specific example has to do with lip reading, which you've learned about, of course, and you've learned that this can induce the McGurk effect and all that cool stuff. And I use that example with the McGurk effect as an instance where the facial information can influence one's perception without even knowing that that the subject is looking at a face. It works even without that kind of insight. So it's encapsulated. But it's also interesting to show that these can actually be informative about things like lip reading. We've done other research to show that you can actually recognize your friends by the way they move their faces as they're speaking. So we put points on people's faces, and the points have to be arranged in kind of a quasi. This isn't actually the stimulus that you're seeing now. When we do the recognition of faces and your friends' faces, the points have to be kind of randomly dispersed so people can't recognize their friends when the points aren't moving. It's only when the points are moving. So the idea here is that you can recognize people, your friends, from how they move their faces as they're speaking without listening to anything. It's just watching their faces. And the same thing is also true with the point light actors, the full body actors. You can recognize your friends if you see points of light moving that were connected to your friends. Their, I guess, style of motion, whether it's a style of motion of a face talking or the style of motion of a person walking, can inform you about who that person is, which is cool. Okay, I'm going to take this stuff off. Don't worry about kinematics and dynamics. It kind of goes beyond what I want to talk about right now. But again, this is the idea that this really shows this kind of dissociation between a specificational information and a simulative information. So there's nothing simulative. When you are able to recognize your friends from seeing their points moving as they walk or seeing their points moving as they talk, there is nothing kind of photographic at all about that. In fact, it doesn't work if you just show a photograph or a still frame of these point light images. It's the motion that has to give you that kind of specificational information. So it's another great example of how a specificational kind of type of information is different from a simulation that we've kind of assumed from other kind of most other perspectives, the simulative assumption. It rejects the simulative assumption, certainly. And also, I think we can go one further here, is reject this idea of the doctrine of the independence of perception from stimulation, where we're thinking about the stimulation here in such a different way. It can be shown to not be independent of perception. It can be shown to be directly correspondent to perception. So let's just remember what this doctrine says. This is different from the intractable non-specificity. Intractable non-specificity says there's nothing specificational in the light that tells you about the world. That Gibson's rejecting. That's probably his most important move, is to try to find the specificational information that tells the perceiver about the world. This doctrine of the independence of stimulation from perception we discussed as examples from the Gestaltist images and stuff like that, where it was assumed that what you have available to you at the stimulus level isn't enough to provide perception enough for perceptual recognition. And here Gibson's saying is, yeah, no, if it's specificational information, that specificational information is reflected onto the sensory organs in this invariant form, then we can say what's available on stimulation is sufficient for perception. So they are completely dependent. Perception is dependent on stimulation. It's a rejection of that second sort of barrier. Okay. Let's continue let's see, hold on a second. I think, what do I have here next? Hold on just a second. What's next? Yes, okay, let's stay with this. Okay, we're going to go back to this notion of the optic array as being defined by the surfaces. Remember, we're talking about reflected light. But it's not just defined by the surfaces, they're also defined by the point of observation. And the example I've been going back to time and time again is the global flow example. And we can kind of stay with that. This is sometimes called perspective structure. And it is kind of an ability to perceive in perspective, in the sense, what I mean by perspective here is something that's going to occur in the future. To have kind of a perspective on this would be, we're not talking about artist's perspective or something here with two-dimensional painting. We're talking about perspective of something that's going to occur. And that's going to have to be based on present information. Okay, so, if we're talking about how perception can support successful action, we're going to have to somehow rationalize anticipation. Basically, that's what we're going to be talking about. That's where we're headed. anticipation, anticipatory behaviors, okay? And the idea is to be able to find information that's available to a point of observation that will be useful for determining when something will happen in, say, the near future. So this is anticipation. And it's going to be something that's going to be available, as we'll see, to a moving observer, all right? And I think is a great example of that, what we just discussed, that transformational invariant. That's going to be something that's going to tell us about the nature of a change out in the environment that is providing an invariant form of stimulation at the eye, in this case, and is very closely tied to global flow, as I've been saying, our kind of go-to example of these sorts of things. So what we're going to be talking about, no, you've already seen this. Really, it's the same type. I put this slide just to remind us about, but I've saying this so many times now, that what we are talking about is trying to find how lawful information is generated, and how, based on that link, that lawful link between the generated information and the whatever sort of act, forward movement, backward movement, and everything is existing, it's going to provide specificational information for what's going on. What we're talking about here is, as I said, anticipation or looming perception. Often this is called. I can't remember if your readings talk about it as looming perception or perceptual anticipation, but it's the same thing as far as we're concerned here. And they're great examples because we know these things that, we seem to be very sensitive to looming perception. And by the way, I should just say, as kind of an aside, I used to study, I haven't in a long time, looming perception for auditory sources as well as visual sources. I've been involved in projects relating to the Prius problem and how we're able to perceive looming cars based on sounds, but what happens if the sounds aren't there anymore? So I've been working with the National Federation of the Blind on that problem. But we're going to be talking about it in the context of sight. And we know from an early age, infants, as early as they can be tested, infants seem to detect when things are coming towards them. Okay, so as soon as you can test them, you put them in a little seat that has sensors on them, and then you project to them a circle that dilates on the screen, and they will show, even at a few days of age, sensitivity to that dilating circle, that dilating disc, I should say. So they move their little heads a little bit. They show avoidant type of behaviors as soon as their visual system is old enough to detect that sort of thing, which I guess for them is a few days. So infants seem sensitive to it. Okay, this seems like a kind of critical thing for our survival. And then you find people that get amazing at this. So baseball players, of course, and football players too, where, if you know a little bit about professional baseball, the balls are thrown at close to 100 miles an hour. And because of that fact, the batter has to make some decisions about whether to swing at the ball, when to swing, where to swing, and how to swing long before the ball gets there. There's just no way that their reactivity allows them to change very much once the pitcher releases the ball. So much of what they're basing their judgment on is just when the ball is released from the pitcher. You can fine tune it a tiny bit, but not a whole lot, because the muscles just don't react that fast given how fast the ball is coming towards the batter. And in fact, this is known from laboratory experiments, and they typically bring in, I think, players on the college teams, and they have machines set up, pitching machines set up. But what they'll do is after the ball leaves the pitching machine, they will shut the lights off in the room, in the gymnasium or whatever, and find out how much of the pitch the batter actually needs to see in order to make a successful swing. And it turns out they need to see relatively little of it, given how fast it's coming. So using kind of occluded trajectories, whether that involves, sometimes they have the batters wear goggles that can be switched off at a very precise moment as the ball leaves the machine, or sometimes the lights in the gymnasium will go off as soon as the ball leaves the machine. And by kind of setting those timings up, they can find out what the batter needs to see in order to successfully make contact with the ball. And it turns out they need relatively little of the pitch. Okay, maybe the first, they do well if they're able to see it right when it leaves the machine. They'll do better if they see the first, I think, quarter or third of the trajectory as it comes towards them. But then between that and the rest of the trajectory at those sort of speeds, 100 miles an hour or whatever, okay, it doesn't make a difference. Everything they're doing, every decision they're making, every action they're performing is determined at the very early part of that trajectory as it comes towards them. How are they able to do that? And there's been a lot of research on this. Our colleague who was recently retired, John Anderson, had a whole research program on this. It was really fascinating. Sometimes this, I can tell you a little bit about this research. This research is called time to contact. And so basically, somehow the perceiver has to judge when the ball will be at their position. And I should mention that this is actually, I've been giving kind of these extreme examples of a disc approaching a poor little baby or the baseball batter. But in a lot of ways, many, if not, majority of actions we perform are kind of time to contact sort of actions. So when I reach out to grab my glass of water here, okay, I am timing my contact so that I can successfully open my hand and then apply the right sort of pressure so I can maintain a grip on it. And so I am perceiving the time to contact, in this case, of me moving towards something. Going to hug your children or your significant others, going to type on a keyboard. In some ways, these are all time to contact sorts of judgments. These are, very, very kind of core to the behaviors that we perform. So this is, important stuff. Let's talk about it in terms of the baseball player. What folks have done is they've come up with they've determined that there is an optical property which, if it can be detected, can inform about when a time to contact will occur. Okay, and it is called the tau variable. Okay, and I'm not going to make you worry about the actual mathematics, but it has to do with the inverse of the relative rate of dilation as something's coming towards you, or if you're going towards something else too, if you're moving to hug your significant other or something like that. The dilation of that image, okay, the kind of growth of that image on the retina will tell you something that's going to happen later. Okay? So, I almost wish I had this with sound. What happens, this is not if something comes towards you, here, maybe you can even experience this. I just happen to have a softball. This is a beeping one, by the way, that the blind use. But as this comes towards you, you might notice that it's image dilation. And I know we're talking about images here and stuff like that, but it just kind of makes it a useful way to have an intuition about it. Its rate of dilation isn't constant throughout a constant motion. That rate of dilation, so I'm trying to see what you guys are seeing here. Hold on just a second. I think you guys are seeing this the way I'm meaning it to be seen. Let's just take it. Yeah, here we go. Okay, its rate of dilation starts slow, and the closer it gets, the quicker the dilation occurs. You see how, if you kind of introspect, it seems kind of like a slow change in the expansion of the image. And as it comes closer and closer, it expands faster and faster, like right here. Like, whoa! Is that scary? Whoa. That's important. Because it's the kind of, so if I were to have a little graph here, if I were showing a graph of the rate of dilation, it would start out slow and then speed up. The slope of the speed of dilation, of the change of dilation, would increase as it gets very close to you. And because, in a sense, that's kind of a characteristic of what happens when it gets closer, by being sensitive to that rate of change. It's actually the inverse of the rate of change. The perceptual system can detect where in its trajectory it is and when the object will be at the position of the point of observation. So it's the rate, it is the rate of angular expansion. How quickly the image is expanding as it's coming towards you. You know, it's interesting. I often teach this in my other classes as being similar to the sound information. So it's great. It's such a wonderful example. So in beat baseball, where the baseball players are all blind or blindfolded, the ball comes to you, but you can't use vision, obviously, to be able to hit it or catch it or stop the ball as it's rolling. It comes to you by sound. Here, I'll do it this way. Okay. And if you look at, if you look at the change in intensity, amplitude, it does the exact same thing. It starts off slow at first. As the ball is coming toward you, it starts out slow. But then as it gets closer and closer, that change in amplitude changes quicker and quicker. So it's, you know, kind of exponential like that. And it actually changes at the same rate that, that the optical dilation will change at. So it's kind of an amodal sort of information that can be detected. But the important part for us is that it can tell the brain, it can tell the perceiver when the ball will be at a position. By sampling just a small part of that function, okay, the brain knows when the ball will be at the position of the perceiver. Okay. And in that sense, it's detecting this very kind of, it's kind of complex, this very complex nature of the change that's available on the eye. Okay, it's a flow across the eye that can tell the perceiver about when something in the future is going to happen. And there's these great examples of this. I know this is discussed in one of your readings, the gannet. Gannets are birds that live on cliffs over the ocean. I guess the ones that were studied in this case were in Scotland over, you know, the Isles. You know, if you've ever been there, it's gorgeous, and you kind of can explore these great, beautiful cliffs with grass and rock, and the ocean's down there. And you can watch these birds. These birds do amazing things. They they nest up by the top of the cliffs, and they dive really far, hundreds of feet down, and they spear fish with their beaks. And somebody decided to kind of look at, you know, how they're able to do this, because depending on where they're diving from, the speed at which they dive will be different from time to time, right? The speed at which they and the other thing they have to do, they have to kind of, you know, as they're diving and looking for these fish, they want to be able to kind of guide their dive up until the very last second when they have to pull in their wings, or if they don't, their little wings will break. It's not a pretty thing for a gannet. So that's exactly what you're seeing here. They're diving, and they're kind of guiding their flight as they're diving to try to, you know, get the fish that's close to the surface of the water. And they want to be able to guide that dive as much as they can, but they have to pull at their wings in order to not break their wings and have a successful dive. And they you know, took films of these birds diving in all these different situations from different heights, obviously going in different speeds, and they pulled it their wings at different distances from the surface. But what was the same from case to case was the wing retraction when they were pulling in their wings was always at the same time before they contacted the water. So if it, you know, here's the water, here's the bird, it's going to be a dive from a lower height, and I'm not going to get that much acceleration up because I'm lower. I retract my wings at the last moment. If it's higher, I'm going faster, which means that probably what's going to happen is I'm going to have to retract my wings a little bit sooner, because the time between the wing retraction and when the bird hits the surface is pretty much exactly the same for every bird and every dive. Suggesting is what they might be doing is detecting something about the visual information, this dilation of the quote image, the visible texture coming off of the ocean surface, and making a time to contact, a time to I guess collision with the water, in order to judge when to pull it off. They're judging it. It seems they're basing that behavior on a time, which could in fact be very easily be that time to contact variable. So this is sometimes called, this is the term I messed up. Prospective information is information for the future. That I used the wrong term before. I was thinking about it when I said perspective. Prospective information is information about the future. And since so many of our behaviors are anticipatory, whether we are grabbing a glass of water, whether we are, moving towards hugging a significant other, whether, we're trying to catch a baseball being thrown at us and that sort of thing, there's got to be information, according to Gibson. There has to be information in the stimulation that is telling us something about this. It's not as if there's, he wants to be able to do this by showing information for behaviorally relevant action, right? Or sorry, a behaviorally relevant perceptual property that's going to guide an action, so it can be successful at anticipating some sort of situation, diving into the water, hitting a baseball, opening your arms and closing them to hug a significant other. So in a sense, what he's saying is that there's information in available occurrent or present information, okay, that is going to affect behavior. So there's information about the future that's affecting the present in a way, being that there's information there to tell me when the ball's going to be at my position. That's an optical variable, the rate of change of the expansion, okay, that's going to affect whether or not I swing and where I swing. Okay, so that's what's meant here. It's kind of a flowery sort of phrase. The future affects the present. Typically, when we think about that, we think about models of what's going. The brain kind of deriving models of what's going to happen. And Gibson's saying, forget that. Let's see if there is information, reliable information, in these optical variables, in these transformational invariants that are available on the retina, such that the perceiver knows, based on specificational information, when the object will be at their position. Again, if nothing else, we can say this, that again, we're talking about there being specificational information for something in a way that hasn't happened yet. So there is nothing simulative about the informational form of this situation whatsoever. Okay. Let me take a second here and see if there's any questions.
This just reminds me of a really like a modern theory, which is called the predictive coding theory.
Okay.
Which is invented by Carl Friston, and he just talking about our behavior is just always based on our predictions about the future. So
right, and where do those predictions come from for him?
Like he is describing all the things in a mathematical way. Like we are always doing model comparison in our brain. Yeah, like we generate multiple predictions based on our long-term memory maybe, and then we just compare these models.
Right. So we have representations of the different things that could happen in the future. Basically.
Yeah.
Right. So that's different from this, right? In the sense that what Gibson's saying is that information for the future event is there in the optical variable.
Yeah.
See what I'm saying?
Yeah. So here's only one possibility.
What's that?
So here's there's only one possibility. Yeah, like we're just directly calculating the future based on the current status.
Right. But it's not a calculation for Gibson. Again, this is something that is so reliable because of the informational form. It's invariant from time and time and time. In fact, it's invariant over modalities, right? That it's that kind of the nature of change of the the energy, whether we're talking about sound or the dilation of the image. It's something that's valuable to the senses that can kind of specify what's going to happen soon and when it's going to happen. So he wants to kind of take all that sort of, this is in a sense one of the least intuitive examples of this. I think it's a great example of it. And when you read the papers, I think you'll get a better idea. But it's like, well, of course we're able to perform anticipation because we have models of things that are going to happen available to us in our brains, right? Just like you said, we have representations of things that could happen. And what he's saying is, let's see if we can do this without these representations and see if there is actually information that's telling us when something is going to happen. And he says, when the visual system samples from that curve, it knows then when that object is going to be at your position.
But it still needs predictions, right? Because
the brain's not making predictions. In a sense, the information is making predictions, or the information is just telling the brain this is when this is going to happen, right?
This feels kind of like a semantic argument, though. Like,
could be.
You're just calling it something different, and it's the same thing.
Well, but think about yeah, you could think of it like this, but I guess the goal then becomes very different for an ecological perspective on anticipation, where you're looking at the information that's going to tell you when this is going to happen, rather than looking at, okay, what is the brain's doing an analysis of the time and the distance and all those things, and then the brain has to rely on all these different ways of kind of anticipating when something would happen. Again, remember the goal here is to give the brain less to do, right? In the sense of making kind of the processing, the exertion involved in mental process, mental embellishment, enhancement is going to be, kind of lessened. And so wouldn't it be nice if a lot of this is available in the stimulus? So yeah, I mean, you can say it's semantic, whether you talk about it as, anticipation is anticipation regardless of what you're assuming the input is. But I'm saying here for Gibson, the input is going to take care of a lot of the potentially theoretical problems we've dealt with before, if in fact he's right about this, right? So, one of the problems with things like the homunculus and all that, or the amount of things needed to, let me make sure I got this right. Yeah, what is needed if in fact the input is impoverished, including representation. Right? If we can rely on representation less and less in describing perception, and instead rely on an informational form that's very rich, that would help, right? Potentially. I mean, if we can say this is physics, this isn't mental processing, this is physics, potentially that would help.
It seems to me that like this kind of explanation doesn't require past experience to draw upon.
Right. So we will be talking about that. How does learning play a role here? The examples I've given so far do sound kind of innate, don't they? So I've talked about the infants and being sensitive to looming and all that sort of stuff. Perceptual learning has to come into play here. And in fact, people get better at this. So, when you're first learning to hit a baseball, boy, are you awful at picking out the very kind of detailed nuances of that time to contact variable. But little by little, you learn to detect more detail in it. So there is certainly perceptual learning, even at the level of something so basic as this time to contact variable. But we'll have to figure out what that involves. Does it involve kind of a new set of representations? Does it involve kind of an education to attending to the right stimulus variables? How do you think about that and make it more consistent with Gibson's idea of putting the onus on the stimulus input rather than on the recreation of the perceptual world by the brain? What is the way to conceive of learning that is consistent with the former?
Yeah, so it's like you can get better at it with time, but it's not like you need practice in order to know that ball is coming at you.
Yeah, the
or
basics,
that
you're
it's
absolutely
moving.
right. Yeah, and it's going to, right. And clearly what we're talking about here is a type of perception that's much more, kind of animal general, in the sense that, Gibson wanted to be able to explain the fundamentals of perception, so it could explain what animals do, what insects do, what people do. And yeah, people can introspect and do things like sensory psychophysics if they're asked to make those sort of judgments and stuff like that. But let's first see what guides successful behavior in all these animals. Are there perceptual principles that do that? Just because this was a time where the language of thought was a really kind of important concept that we should think of all of cognition as being quasi-linguistic, and he thought that was an absolute misguided sort of approach, thinking that just because humans have the ability to have this generative kind of language doesn't mean that cool ability should be thought of as the basis for perception if we want to be able to describe perception at its most fundamental level, which is going to incorporate all types of perception regardless of the animal. So yeah, you're absolutely right. Okay. Oh, I guess we should stop here. That's great. We're going to start getting into the incommensurability natural kinds question next, and perceptual meaning, which I think, if you thought that stuff was radical, wait till you see this stuff. I think you'll find it even more kind of provocative, talking about perceptual meaning from Gibson's perspective. Okay. All right. Have a good week, and we'll finish up the course next week. Bye.